At 4:15 a.m. on the morning of December the 8th, 1941, Singaporeans had a rude and deadly awakening.
Japanese bombs rained down on Singapore, and though no one realized it at the time, this was the beginning of the end for Great Britain's empire in the Far East.
Troops of Imperial Japan were landing in southern Thailand and northern Malaya, and a devastating aerial attack had been mounted on the American Pacific Fleet in Hawaii at Pearl Harbor, seen here in this Japanese propaganda film made after that event. The Second World War had been going on for 15 months in Europe, and now Japan had brought the war to the east as well. Now it was truly a global conflict.
Despite the Japanese bombing and the landings up north, at first no one seemed particularly worried. They lived in the impregnable Fortress Singapore, and it was inconceivable anyway that anyone should get this far down. Governor Sir Shenton Thomas apparently remarked to his officer commanding, Lieutenant General Percival, "But I suppose you'll shove the little men off." It was easier said than done.
Military and civilian leaders were already squabbling amongst themselves. How could it have happened? Whose fault was it? What to do? General Yamashita, who was in command of the Japanese invasion force, was in no doubt about what he wanted to do. He intended to put the governor of Singapore and the Strait Settlements, Sir Shenton Thomas, out of a job. And so far, the British Imperial Army wasn't proving too much of an obstacle.
In time-honoured fashion, the British Navy took up the challenge, and the battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the cruiser Repulse slipped anchor and headed out to sea, hopefully to wreak havoc on the Japanese invasion fleet off the northern coastline of Malaya. A comforting and inspiring sight, but they were headed into battle without any air cover.
British military intelligence agencies proved not to be very intelligent. Despite what happened at Pearl Harbor, they grossly underestimated the ability of the Japanese Air Force. The Prince of Wales and the Repulse were attacked from the air and were sunk.
In the 48 hours since the first bombs had rained down on Singapore, Japanese forces had secured their northern invasion beaches, captured a vital British airfield, and sent two of Britain's finest warships to the bottom of the South China Sea. And if that wasn't bad enough, things were about to get considerably worse.
Seasoned and jungle-trained Japanese soldiers cut through Malaya like a knife through butter. In a lightning campaign, they arrived on Singapore's back doorstep in Johor, and it was now painfully apparent that someone had left the back door wide open. Lack of air cover had doomed the Prince of Wales and the Repulse, and Singapore too was defenseless against attack from the air.
The RAF had first-rate pilots but only second-rate aircraft. Slow and ponderous planes that were obsolete long before the war in Europe even started. They were no match for the Mitsubishi Zero fighter, and they were quickly shot out of the skies in a desperately uneven battle.
Seletar Military Airfield was on the front line of the air attacks, and the heavy steel doors of a workshop still bear the scars.
No one can pin down precisely when it happened, since Japanese visitors were pretty frequent in those days. A lone Japanese Zero pilot swooped down over the aerodrome, thumbed on his guns, and stitched his signature in cannon shells across these heavy steel doors behind me.
Shrapnel from bombs added to the damage, and the thin walls of the workshop would have been torn to pieces.
And his handiwork is still here today, as you can see. A little known but very sobering reminder of frightening times. You can't visit the site, and you certainly wouldn't have wanted to have been here at the time. God help anyone who got in the way of this.
It's debatable whether the manner in which soldiers and Singaporeans met their maker was of much concern to them. Death was permanent. However, it arrived. And it was arriving more often now that Japanese artillery spotters were directing their shell fire from the top of the Istana across the causeway. In 1942, this was the highest point in Johor Bahru and offered an excellent view of much of Singapore. Artillery shells as well as bombs now rained down over the island.
Lieutenant General Percival had vetoed the construction of beach defences along the northern shore of Singapore Island, facing Malaya, because he felt that even to suggest the possibility that the Japanese would get this far would have been to undermine civilian morale. As it happens, they were here, and there was not a lot to be done about it. Even so, when one comes to consider the figures, there were some 33,000 Japanese troops up against more than 120,000 soldiers of the British Empire. So on paper at least, the odds would still seem to have been pretty much in the favour of the British. The trouble was, they didn't know this. And in fact, the British Empire was headed downhill towards its greatest military defeat since the loss of the American colonies. After the break, find out how this came about. The great advantage that the attacker has over a defender is that whereas the latter must anticipate an assault on all fronts, the attacker can concentrate his forces. And that's precisely what General Yamashita did. The situation on the 7th of February 1942 doesn't look quite so promising for the island's defenders, does it? This is the Sarimbun Kranji coast on the night of the 8th of February, and the area has been pulverized by a devastating Japanese barrage which has torn apart the communication system. A mixed force of 900 Australian and Chinese defenders are spread out over 4 kilometers. That's only a handful of men for every 50 meters, and they're more than a little concerned. 6,000 Japanese soldiers were on their way to introduce themselves, and the defenders were too thinly spread on the ground to hold them back. So where was everybody else whilst all this was happening?
The Japanese had sent a couple of hundred soldiers obviously and noisily across to Pulau Ubin and achieved the desired effect. Lieutenant General Percival shifted the bulk of his forces to confront a perceived invasion that was merely a clever diversion.
Well, 12,000 crack British troops were sitting opposite Pulau Ubin, where it was thought that the main Japanese assault would begin. But the attack had already begun, right here at Kranji. In bunkers and gun emplacements opposite Pulau Ubin, the British Army was spoiling for a fight. But the real battle for Singapore Island was actually taking place some 20 kilometers to the west, and had already been lost. The first of General Yamashita's 2 great bluffs had succeeded, and by the time Percival had acknowledged his mistake, it was too late to do anything about it.
Within days, lines of communication had been disrupted, and the Japanese moved inland on 2 fronts. Morale plummeted as soldiers and civilians pulled back. Lieutenant General Percival and his staff moved out of their Sime Road military headquarters and headed for Fort Canning Hill to take up residence in the battle box. Communications with the front lines were difficult to maintain, and orders issued from the isolated command center reflected little understanding of the real situation on the ground. Disgruntled troops gave the battle box another name. They called it Confusion Castle. The jungle of 60 years ago is long gone, but a single reminder of World War II remains. It's unlikely that this bunker on Pasir Panjang Road ever saw any action. Unscarred and undamaged, it's likely that it was simply bypassed by Japanese soldiers. It's equally unlikely that soldiers manning this beachfront defensive position at Labrador Park ever fired their guns in anger. Like its counterpart in Pasir Panjang Road, it appears to have suffered no damage. But a few hundred meters away, on Pulau Belakang Mati, now known as Sentosa, action did take place. Extensive fortifications were first built here in the 19th century. They'd been expanded and upgraded over the years and constituted a formidable defensive position. The core of the position was the large caliber guns that had been strategically sited to defend the harbour and its approaches from naval attack.
One can't help but feel a little sorry for the soldiers who manned the heavy guns at Fort Siloso and elsewhere. They had trained long and hard to perfect themselves for a battle which in the end never took place. Had the Japanese been obliging enough to launch a full frontal attack on the harbour, then I'm sure they would have acquitted themselves well. But they didn't. They came in through the back door, across the causeway, and these frustrated gunners, instead of being the main event, were relegated to a mere sideshow. And what about that old myth that the guns could only fire out to sea and could not be turned around to fire inland? Absolute rubbish. Of course they could, and indeed they were, but they still weren't much use. Why? Because their shells were armor-piercing, intended to punch holes in the steel hulls of battleships. High explosive shells, which would have been effective against troop concentrations, just simply weren't in the armory. This modest 12-pounder, on the other hand, was instrumental in sending a Japanese troopship to the bottom.
A placid park today, but 60 years ago, Kent Ridge was in the line of advance of a Japanese division on its way to the Alexandra Barracks and Hospital in the valley beyond.
The Malay regiment was assigned to defend the specific ridge here against the Japanese coming down the western coast of Singapore. The Malay regiment, which had been formed in the pre-war years by the British as an experiment in defending Malaya, had been pulled back from the Malay Peninsula to help in the defense of Singapore. And they were assigned to defend this ridge. Now, where exactly, we unfortunately don't know because the landscape has changed quite considerably. And it was on this ridge here that the Malay regiment made a dramatic final stand to almost the last man in the battle against the Japanese. The Japanese were, I think, taken by surprise by the tenacity of the regiment. And when they finally overcame the Malay positions, they took out their anger by massacring almost all the members of the regiment that they could find, including Lieutenant Adnan, whom they strung upside down and bayoneted. Today we have commemorated this final, ultimate sacrifice of Lieutenant Adnan and his men in an exhibition we've entitled Reflections on Bukit Chandu. It's significant because here in this final battle for Singapore, it was the sacrifice of the local Malay regiment that was done here.
Having overwhelmed the Malay regiment on Kent Ridge, the Japanese then came down the hill and attacked Alexandra Barracks. There, to General Yamashita's shame, they burst in on the military hospital and bayoneted doctors, nurses, and patients in their beds. This whole area here at Dempsey Road was part of the vast military complex of Tanglin Barracks and had come under constant shell fire from the Japanese since they consolidated their bridgehead and moved inland. It must have been a scene of frantic activity as soldiers withdrew from here down Holland Road to take up a final defensive position. By this time, it must have been evident to civilians and fighting men alike that the noose was tightening around them as they prepared to make a last stand.
By mid-February 1942, the defenders had been pushed back into a tiny area centered on Singapore City. But General Yamashita's troops were starving, exhausted, and running out of ammunition. He was running out of time. Aware that success or failure balanced on a knife edge, he carried out his second and greatest bluff and demanded an immediate and unconditional surrender. General Yamashita presented his surrender demands. He threatened, he bullied, he shouted, and he won. General Percival didn't wish to prolong the suffering of civilians and soldiers. He signed the surrender document and he gave Singapore away.
Military historians and scholars have been debating the fall of Singapore for 60 years and will probably continue to do so for centuries. Would a few days more resistance or a stronger personality in charge have made Singapore's history entirely different? I wonder.
British imperial troops were marched off to captivity in Changi Prison, and Singapore's name was changed to Shionanto, Light of the South.
There were a few who rejoiced in the humbling of the British Empire and who wanted to believe that what the Japanese called the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere would indeed meet an Asian Brotherhood of Nations. But they were soon to be sadly disappointed.
Within a month of the island's capitulation, the Japanese demanded that practically the entire Chinese population report at a number of registration centers where they were interrogated. Many of them were released, but many more were never seen again.
Operation Cleanup, or Song Cheng in Cantonese, was ostensibly a registration exercise, but in reality it turned out to be more of a genocide. The elimination of local Chinese who were deemed to have supported mainland China's resistance to Japanese occupation also eliminated anybody who could possibly cause trouble for the Japanese here in Singapore in the future. And that meant just about anyone. Changi Beach, a pleasant enough spot today, but a killing ground back in 1942. Countless young Chinese men, some of them no more than boys, were machine gunned here in the shallows in the early days of the Japanese occupation. Not for any reason that they would have understood, but simply because they might have provided future resistance to the new masters of Singapore. Some put the figure at 20,000, others as high as 60,000. They were non-combatants. There are no military records, and the true figure will never be known.
The YMCA, Young Men's Christian Association building next to Singapore's History Museum, was taken over by the Kempeitai, the Japanese military secret police. Throughout the 42 months of occupation, it was perversely used as an interrogation and torture center. Countless people of all races were brought here and mostly didn't leave the building alive. Singaporeans endured Japanese occupation until in August 1945, the war came to an abrupt and unexpected conclusion.
Japan surrendered and in time learned that the advantages of becoming an economic superpower far outweighed those of being a military superpower.
The British learnt a lesson too, that the empire was an outdated and expensive concept. So they packed their bags and went home.
And Singapore learnt a lesson too. Don't try and defend the island with a second-rate air force. I had the privilege to be invited out to Paya Lebar a few months back by the Air Force to witness some spectacular military hardware in action.
The Brits might have gone, but their terminology lives on. The Singapore Air Force are executing a scramble, a rapid takeoff to meet an incoming threat, and the term dates back to World War II. But that's the only thing in common between then and now.
I only regret that Lieutenant General Percival couldn't have been with me to see all this. It's the air defense he wished he had, but unfortunately didn't.
The fledgling air arm of Singapore's Defence Forces had originally been known as the Singapore Air Defence Command, changing its name in 1975 to the Republic of Singapore Air Force. It regularly goes shopping for premium products and gives them to pilots who clearly know what to do with them. Nearly 60 years have passed since the end of the war, but evidence of conflict and occupation, even today, continues to be unearthed.
Well, Calder, this looks incredibly interesting stuff. Can you tell me a bit about this weaponry and where it was discovered?
Well, these were discovered at the Sembawang Ammo Depot.
The old naval base of the British.
It's part of the old naval base, yes. And these were discovered actually near the guardhouse, spread over some 20 feet and more than 6 feet down. Initially when we found it, of course, only the heavier weapons were on top. But when we started digging it, all the smaller weapons came up as well.
Right.
And you see here quite a range of weapons
Yes.
that were discovered eventually. These little ones here are actually rifles.
Uh-huh.
The stock and all that has disappeared,
Which was made of wood, of course.
which was made of wood, and it's all gone. And you can see that it's actually just a breech here, and that's the barrel.
Right.
Yeah, and
Amazing.
these are machine guns, 7.7 millimeter to 13 millimeter.
Right.
And you can see that over the other side there are the heavier ones. And these heavier ones could be up to 37 millimeter. For example, this one is 37 millimeter.
Right, and they would have been on some sort of mounting, or?
They would be mounted in singles up to fours.
Now, this huge thing over here, what the hell's that?
That's the 37 millimeter. That's the one that was mounted usually on a tank. You can see that there's this.
The
There's
trigger
a
is
trigger there,
really.
so it should be the other way around.
Yes, of course. So I mean, why on earth would they have been interred in the ground?
Well, I guess either the British collected all these weapons and didn't know what to do with it and put it in the ground, or then there's this other theory that the Japanese didn't want to show the chrysanthemum, which was stamped on the stock of the weapon to indicate that these belonged to the emperor.
I see.
And
yes.
it would be useful to just hide all these weapons and surrender
It was
themselves.
sort of loss of face that disgraced the emperor's good name, or?
It could be.
Oh, that's really interesting. I would say it's very intriguing and quite a sort of treasure trove, really. Fantastic.
Yes.
While Julian ponders the past, let's take a look at next week's programme. In Wheels and Wings and Boats and Things, our man clearly has a need for speed. Taking a wild ride on a ghost train through Centrepoint and bidding a fond farewell to a big and beautiful bird at Paya Lebar Airport.
Isn't she magnificent?
From trishaws to trams, from trains to planes, Sight and Sound's going to be well and truly on the move.
Also on the move, but for the Second World War, would have been the old Houses of Parliament, the Victoria Theatre and the Singapore Cricket Club.
The wheels were in motion in the late 30s to demolish the lot and replace them with a new set of government buildings. After the war, people had other things on their minds, and thankfully the plan was quietly forgotten.
Singapore moved on and the British moved out. Except for me, that is, and I'm afraid I'll be around for a while yet. See you next week. And what of that old myth that the guns couldn't... No, sorry, get it right. This is the Serembun Kanji coast on the 8th of February. No, sorry, wrong bloody lines. Shove the little men off. Yeah. Almost done. Let's shove them. Good up to there. Shove them, not steer them. I should have wagged my finger, it wasn't very good. Here's a bit more action there. An inspiring and comforting sight, but unfortunately they were lacking something or other. Unfortunately, what?